10 years ago, Edward Fairfax was a 49-year-old millionaire who loved being seen as the smartest man in the room. So when a 16-year-old kid asked him publicly if buying Bitcoin made sense, Edward didn't just disagree. He laughed, he mocked the idea, and he made sure everyone else laughed too. What Edward didn't realize was that some people don't forget moments like that. And years later, when Edward walked into the office believing his position was untouchable, he was about to learn how quietly power can change hands. They didn't put Edward Fairfax on a stage this time because there was no announcement to be made, only an adjustment to reality that didn't require applause. It was a gray Tuesday morning in early autumn when Edward, 49, London-born son of a secondary school head teacher and a pharmacist, arrived at the Canary Wharf office just before 9, lifting his chin slightly as he always did when passing through glass doors. Charcoal Savile Row suit pressed, former fund crest pinned to his lapel, believing posture still counted for something, while downstairs, the trading floor hummed with its ordinary, unromantic noise. 10 years earlier, he'd been called a millionaire on television, and no one had corrected him, and the word had stayed with him like a courtesy title, even as his margins thinned and his confidence began living off habit rather than fact. Callum Reid arrived moments later, 26, Manchester accent softened by London, navy jumper over a white shirt, clean trainers, no watch, carrying nothing but his phone and a slim laptop, walking straight past reception with the ease of someone who didn't need to prove access. The same boy Edward vaguely remembered from a charity breakfast years ago, the teenager who'd asked about Bitcoin and been laughed off with an easy line and a hand on the shoulder for the cameras. This morning, Callum didn't acknowledge that memory because it had no currency anymore. Maya D'Souza, 22, admin assistant.
Indian British, first in her family to work in finance, stood at the operations desk with a clipboard pressed lightly against her hip, having already corrected a misprint on Edward's new access badge. Never Ed, always Edward, before anyone noticed. Watching Edward rub the corner of his jaw the way her father did before dentist appointments. Edward sat at his desk on the mezzanine, the one shipped over after the acquisition, but rebuilt without private drawers, and opened his inbox to find a calendar invite marked mandatory. Sender, Callum Reid. Subject, role alignment. Duration, 15 minutes. He smiled faintly, the smile of a man used to meetings rearranging themselves around him, and walked to the glass office at the scheduled time, where Callum was already seated, hands folded loosely, posture relaxed. There were no raised voices, no accusations, only documents printed and stacked neatly between them. Company's house filings dated weeks earlier, termination of Edward Fairfax as person with significant control, satisfaction of charges, migration schedules, a redacted bank notice referencing a personal guarantee Edward had kept contained for 6 weeks with a revolving credit line, and the quiet sale of a Mayfair flat he pretended he'd never owned. Callum spoke evenly, explaining reporting lines, committee authority, and the necessity of consistency going forward, using we and our with the calm confidence of someone whose position no longer needed defense. Edward listened without interrupting, eyes fixed just below Callum's chin, hands clasped, feeling the familiar sensation of authority dissolve without confrontation, the way fog lifts without sound. When the meeting ended, Maya was waiting outside with a slim envelope and a printed schedule, her handwriting precise, her tone professional, as she said, "These are the papers you'll need, Mr. Fairfax." Not lowering her eyes, not adding anything unnecessary, simply reflecting competence back at him. At 10:11, facilities arrived quietly with a small screwdriver,
loosening the engraved nameplate outside Edward's office, Edward Fairfax, Legacy Integration, and replacing it with Operations. Slipping the old plate into a padded envelope without ceremony, the faint metallic click carrying farther than expected. Edward watched through the glass as his belongings were placed into a cardboard archive box on his desk. Framed certificate, yacht model, a photograph from a golf day with a minister whose name no one used anymore. Inventory initialed neatly by someone in operations. Later, pressing his badge to the access door of his newly assigned area, it blinked red once, then green, and someone behind him waited without recognition, already adjusted to the new map of the building, where his name no longer appeared on the glass. And Edward stepped aside, holding the door open out of habit, understanding finally that status, once detached from control, evaporates quietly and leaves no echo. And if you're finding this story compelling, make sure to leave a comment below about a time when you realized your position wasn't as secure as you thought, because those moments of clarity matter. And subscribe to never miss stories that remind us credentials without substance eventually reveal themselves. And Edward Fairfax had never been the kind of man who questioned his trajectory, because the trajectory for as long as he could remember had been upward, with a momentum that felt less like luck and more like destiny. And he'd grown up in Hertfordshire in a semi-detached house, where his father, a secondary school head teacher, had taught him that education was the path to security, and his mother, a community pharmacist, had reinforced this with her own steady demonstrations of professional reliability, showing up every day, serving the neighborhood with quiet competence. And Edward had absorbed these lessons, not as ideology but as foundation, the way a child learns gravity before learning the word for physics. And by the time he graduated from the London School of Economics, he
already understood that in finance, confidence was mistaken for capability, that the appearance of expertise generated actual authority, and that the network you cultivated mattered more than the work you produced. And his early career had unfolded during the boom years, when money moved fast and questions moved slowly, when a good suit and a firm handshake could carry you through meetings where nobody fully understood the instruments being traded. And Edward had been good at those meetings, good at nodding at the right moments, good at using phrases like risk-adjusted returns and capital efficiency, good at making other people feel like he knew something they didn't. And the truth was, he did know some things. He wasn't incompetent. He'd passed his exams. He understood the mechanics of trading. He could read a balance sheet. But his knowledge was exactly sufficient, never exceptional. And in an industry where perception often mattered more than performance, sufficient was enough to build a career. And he'd made money, not extraordinary money, but enough to maintain the aesthetic of success. The Mayfair flat, the Savile Row suits, the membership at a club in St. James's, where he'd have lunch twice a month with people who were performing the same carefully calibrated version of success. And none of them ever questioned each other, because questioning would require admitting that their own foundations might be equally uncertain. And Edward had believed his own performance so thoroughly that it stopped feeling like performance. It became his reality. And when a small television crew had interviewed him in 2014 during a segment about fintech disruption, and the presenter had referred to him as a millionaire, Edward had smiled and not corrected her, because correcting her would have required explaining that his net worth was complicated, that much of it was leveraged, that the flat was mortgaged, that his liquidity was thinner than it appeared, and the word millionaire had stayed with him.
After that segment aired, appearing in his professional biography, showing up in introductions at conferences, becoming part of his identity, even as the market shifted and his actual financial position became more precarious. And this was the version of Edward Fairfax who arrived at the Canary Wharf office that gray Tuesday morning in early autumn, believing that his position was secure because it had always been secure, because he'd spent decades building a reputation that he assumed was portable and durable, like a title that couldn't be revoked. And he didn't know that Callum Reed, the boy he vaguely remembered from a charity breakfast years ago, had spent the last decade building something entirely different. Not a reputation, but a foundation. Not an image, but a business. And Edward had encountered Callum briefly at that charity event back in 2015, when Callum was 16 years old, attending with his mother, who worked in catering. And Callum had approached Edward during a break between speeches and asked about Bitcoin. And Edward had laughed, not cruelly, but dismissively, the way you laugh at a child who asks if they can drive the car. And Edward had said something like, "That's not real money, son. That's speculation for people who don't understand markets." And he'd put his hand on Callum's shoulder for the cameras that were circulating the room, capturing moments of mentorship and access. And Callum had nodded and thanked him,
and walked away. And Edward had forgotten the interaction immediately because it had no significance to him. Just another moment of noblesse oblige, another opportunity to demonstrate that he was the kind of successful person who made time for young people. And what Edward didn't know was that Callum hadn't forgotten the interaction at all, had in fact carried it with him as a kind of fuel. Not resentment exactly, but clarity, a clear understanding that people like Edward spoke with authority that wasn't earned, with confidence that wasn't justified, and
that their dismissiveness said more about their limitations than about the ideas they were dismissing. And Callum had gone home that night and continued learning about blockchain and cryptocurrency and decentralized finance, not because Edward had discouraged him, but because Edward's discouragement had confirmed that the institutions Edward represented didn't understand what was coming. And over the next decade, while Edward was maintaining his position, attending the same lunches, wearing the same suits, performing the same version of expertise, Callum was building an actual business. And if this story is making you rethink what expertise really means, hit that subscribe button, because we're about to explore how credibility built on performance crumbles when tested against substance. And leave a comment sharing a time when someone underestimated you, because those stories matter, and they remind us that dismissal often says more about the person doing the dismissing than the person being dismissed. And Callum had started small, working nights at a logistics company while teaching himself to code, building small applications that solved minor inefficiencies, trading cryptocurrency in tiny amounts, learning by doing rather than by credentialing. And he'd connected with other builders, people who were less interested in talking about disruption and more interested in actually building things. And by 2018, he'd co-founded a company that provided blockchain-based solutions for supply chain transparency. And the company had grown slowly at first, because real businesses grow slowly, because trust takes time, because clients need proof, not promises. And by 2020, when the pandemic forced industries to rethink their infrastructure, Callum's company was ready, with working products, with case studies, with a track record, and the growth accelerated. And by 2022, the company had secured institutional funding, had expanded into financial services, had acquired
smaller competitors. And Callum, who was now 26, had become exactly the kind of operator that people like Edward claimed to be. Someone who understood markets, understood technology, understood how to build systems that created value rather than just extracting it. And when Callum's company began acquiring legacy financial services firms as part of a consolidation strategy, Edward's firm was on the list. Not because Edward's firm was special, but because it had assets that could be integrated, and a client base that could be migrated, and a brand that still carried some residual credibility. And the acquisition had happened quietly over the course of 6 months. Due diligence, legal filings, regulatory approvals, all handled by teams of lawyers and accountants, while Edward continued showing up to the office, attending meetings, maintaining the routines that had defined his professional life. And he'd been told, of course, that changes were coming, that integration would require adjustments, that some roles would be restructured, but he'd assumed, as he always assumed, that these changes would happen around him, not to him, because he was Edward Fairfax, because his name was on documents, because he had relationships, and relationships, he believed, were currency. And what he didn't understand was that in Callum's world, relationships without performance were liabilities, not assets. That legacy without innovation was weight, not value. And the integration had proceeded methodically. Systems migrated, clients transitioned, staff reassigned, and Edward had watched it happen with a kind of detached curiosity, the way you watch construction on a street you don't live on, interesting but not personal. And then one morning he'd opened his inbox and found the calendar invite marked mandatory from Callum Reed. Subject, role alignment. Duration, 15 minutes. And even then, Edward had assumed this was procedural, a courtesy meeting where Callum would acknowledge Edward's experience, ask for his insights, maybe even
offer him some advisory role that would preserve his dignity. And he'd walk to the glass office at the scheduled time, lifting his chin slightly, the way he always did when entering rooms where he expected to be recognized. And Callum was already seated, hands folded loosely, posture relaxed, wearing a navy jumper over a white shirt, clean trainers, no watch, no cufflinks, no signals of status, because Callum's status didn't require signals, and there were documents on the table between them, printed and stacked neatly, and Callum gestured for Edward to sit, and Edward sat, and Callum began speaking in a tone that was even and professional, not hostile, not performatively kind, just clear, and he explained that the integration was complete, that reporting lines had been finalized, that Edward's role as person with significant control had been terminated weeks earlier, that the personal guarantee Edward had used to secure a credit line, the one he thought was private, had been flagged during due diligence, that the sale of his Mayfair flat had been noted, that his liquidity position was understood, and that going forward, Edward would be transitioning to an operational support role with adjusted compensation and no direct reports. And Callum slid the documents across the table, company's house filings dated weeks earlier, showing the termination, migration schedules showing Edward's new position, a redacted bank notice that somehow Callum's team had accessed. And Edward looked at the documents and felt something fundamental shift inside him, not anger exactly, but a kind of freefall, the sensation of reaching for a railing that isn't there. And he wanted to object, wanted to say this is irregular, wanted to invoke his relationships, his tenure, his reputation, but the documents were legal and complete, and Callum wasn't asking for Edward's approval, wasn't negotiating, wasn't performing power. He was simply informing Edward of decisions that had already been made, and Edward understood in that moment that he had
no leverage, that his position had been an illusion, maintained by momentum, and that momentum had stopped. And Callum continued speaking, using we and our, explaining that the transition would be handled professionally, that Edward's contributions were valued in the past tense, that his experience could still be useful in a support capacity. And Edward heard the words, but they sounded like a language he'd once known, but forgotten, the grammar slipping away even as he tried to hold it. And when the meeting ended, after exactly 15 minutes, Callum stood and extended his hand, and Edward shook it out of reflex and walked out of the glass office. And Maya D'Souza was waiting outside with a slim envelope and a printed schedule, her handwriting precise, her posture composed. And she said, "These are the papers you'll need, Mr. Fairfax," and handed him the envelope. And Edward took it and noticed that Maya didn't lower her eyes, didn't add any unnecessary deference, just reflected competence back at him, the way a mirror reflects light without commentary. And Edward walked back to his desk on the mezzanine and sat down and stared at a screen and tried to process what had just happened. And at 10:11, he heard a faint sound and looked up and saw facilities arriving with a small screwdriver. And he watched as they loosened the engraved nameplate outside his office, Edward Fairfax, Legacy Integration, and replaced it with a simple sign that said, Operations. And they slipped the old nameplate into a padded envelope without ceremony, and the faint metallic click of the screwdriver carried farther than Edward expected, echoing slightly in the open plan space. And he realized that other people were watching. Not obviously, not with cruelty, just with the mild interest people have when witnessing a transition they've already adjusted to. And Edward felt exposed in a way he'd never felt before, because for his entire career, he'd been insulated by titles, by nameplates, by the architecture hierarchy. And now that
architecture was being disassembled in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And over the next hour, someone from operations arrived and began placing his belongings into a cardboard archive box. The framed certificate from a trade association, the model yacht he'd received as a gift from a client, the photograph from a golf day with a minister whose name no one used anymore because the minister had resigned in scandal. And the items looked smaller in the box, less significant, as if their meaning had been contextual, and the context had dissolved. And the person from operations initialed an inventory sheet and left the box on Edward's desk and walked away. And
And Edward sat there, surrounded by the hum of the trading floor, the ordinary, unromantic noise of people doing work that produced actual value. And he thought about Callum, who'd been 16 when they met, who'd asked about Bitcoin, who'd been dismissed, and who was now the person making decisions about Edward's future. And he thought about Maya, who was 22, first in her family to work in finance, who'd corrected his access badge before anyone noticed, and who carried herself with a competence that didn't require validation. And he thought about all the years he'd spent performing expertise, and how that performance had insulated him from ever developing actual depth. And subscribe right now if you want more stories that prove credentials without competence eventually get exposed, because what happens next shows how completely Edward's assumptions have to be rebuilt. And drop a comment telling us whether you think people like Edward can actually change, or if they're just destined to keep performing until there's no audience left. And Edward Fairfax spent the rest of that Tuesday in a kind of suspension, moving through the motions of work, but not really working, sitting at his desk, but not really present. And people walked past him without stopping, without asking if he was all right, because they'd already recalibrated.
Their mental map of the office and Edward's position on that map had changed. And by late afternoon, he stood up and walked to the break room to make tea. And while he was waiting for the kettle, 2 junior analysts were talking near the window. And one of them said, "Did you see they moved Fairfax?" And the other said, "Yeah, I heard he was over-leveraged." And the first one said, "Classic." And they both laughed, not cruelly, just with the casual indifference of people discussing news that doesn't affect them. And Edward stood there, holding his mug, realizing he was being discussed in the third person, as if he were already gone. And he thought about all the times he'd had similar conversations about other people, people who'd been moved or let go or restructured, and he'd never considered what it felt like to be the subject of those conversations. And he walked back to his desk and sat down and stared at his screen and tried to remember the last time he'd done work that actually mattered, work that created value rather than just maintaining appearances. And he couldn't remember, because his career had been built on appearances, on the performance of knowing, on the assumption that confidence could substitute for capability. And that assumption had been correct for a long time, but it wasn't correct anymore, and the world had changed, and Edward hadn't changed with it. And at 5:30, he packed his things into his bag and pressed his new access badge to the door, and it blinked red once, then green, and he walked out of the building into the gray autumn evening and stood on the pavement watching people stream past, bankers and analysts and support staff, all moving with purpose. And Edward felt untethered, as if he were floating slightly above the ground, disconnected from the momentum that had carried him for so long. And he took the tube home to his flat in Clerkenwell, the flat he'd moved to after selling the Mayfair property, the flat that was smaller and darker and didn't have a view. And he sat by the window and looked out at the street and tried to understand what had just happened to his life. And over the following weeks, Edward showed up to work every day because he didn't know what else to do. And his new role was vague administrative support with no clear responsibilities. And he spent his days responding to emails that didn't require responses, attending meetings where his input wasn't requested, sitting at his desk feeling like a placeholder for a position that didn't need to exist. And people were polite to him, but the politeness was thin, transactional, the kind of courtesy you extend to someone who's no longer relevant but hasn't yet realized it. And Edward started noticing things he'd never noticed before, like the fact that Maya arrived at 7:30 every morning, an hour before she needed to, and spent that hour reviewing documents, preparing materials, anticipating problems before they occurred. And he realized she was doing the work he'd always claimed to do, except she was actually doing it, while he'd only ever been performing it. And he started noticing that Callum was in the office at odd hours, not because he was performing dedication, but because he was solving actual problems, talking to clients, reviewing code, meeting with engineers. And Edward realized that Callum's authority didn't come from titles or nameplates or tailored suits. It came from competence, from the ability to create value, from understanding systems deeply enough to improve them. And Edward felt a strange mix of resentment and admiration because he'd spent his entire life believing that success was about presentation, about knowing the right people, about maintaining the right image. And Callum was proving that success was actually about substance, about building things that worked, about earning trust through consistency rather than demanding it through credentials. And one afternoon in late October, Edward was in the break room, and Callum walked in to make coffee, and they were alone. And Edward said,
"Can I ask you something?" And Callum said, "Of course." And Edward said, "Do you remember that charity breakfast in 2015? And Callum paused and then said, "Yes, I remember." And Edward said, "I dismissed you." And Callum said, "Yes, you did." And Edward said, "I was wrong." And Callum looked at him and said, "You weren't wrong about Bitcoin specifically. You were wrong about dismissing things you didn't understand." And Edward nodded, because that was true. And Callum said, "Mr. Fairfax, can I be honest with you?" And Edward said, "Please." And Callum said, "You're good at performing authority, but you've never built anything, and that's why you're here now." And Edward felt his face flush, but he didn't argue, because the truth doesn't require argument. And Callum said, "But that doesn't mean you can't learn." And Edward said, "I'm 49. And Callum said, "So what? My mom went back to university at 52. And Edward said, "What does she do now?" And Callum said, "She's a social worker, and she says it's the first time her work has felt real." And Edward nodded, and he stood there, in the break room, the coffee machine hissing steam. And Callum said, "You have a choice, Mr. Fairfax. You can keep performing, or you can start building." And Edward said, "I don't know how to build." "Then learn." And he took his coffee and walked out. And Edward stood there, alone, feeling something shift, not dramatically, but quietly, like a door opening in a room he didn't know existed. And over the following months, Edward did something he'd never done before, which was admit he didn't know things, and he started asking questions, not rhetorical questions designed to demonstrate his sophistication, but actual questions designed to fill gaps in his understanding. And he started reading, not trade publications that confirmed what he already believed, but technical documentation that explained how systems actually worked. And he started paying attention to the people around him, not to assess their usefulness to him, but to learn from their
competence. And he noticed that Maya had a gift for seeing problems before they materialized, for anticipating what people needed before they asked. And he started asking her how she did that. And she explained that she paid attention, that she kept notes, that she treated every task as if it mattered, because every task did matter. And Edward realized he'd spent decades treating tasks as beneath him, delegating everything, assuming that his value was strategic rather than operational. And Maya said, "Mr. Fairfax, the strategic is built on the operational. If you don't understand the details, you can't make good decisions." And Edward said, "You 22, how do you know this?" And Maya said, "My parents immigrated with nothing. They taught me that dignity comes from doing good work, not from having an impressive title." And Edward felt something crack open inside him, not painfully, but necessarily, the way ice cracks in spring. And he started doing operational work, reviewing documents, preparing reports, double-checking numbers. And at first it felt humiliating because he'd spent his career above these tasks, but slowly it started feeling different. It started feeling real, like he was actually contributing rather than just occupying space. And one day in December, Maya asked him to review a contract for errors, and he found 3, and she thanked him, genuinely. And Edward realized that was the first time in years someone had thanked him for actual work, rather than for his presence, and it felt better than any title he'd ever held. And if you're still with this story, hit that subscribe button because we're approaching the resolution, and it's about to show whether Edward's transformation is genuine or just another performance. And comment below with your thoughts on whether credibility can be rebuilt, or if some reputations are permanently damaged, because that question matters. And winter came, and the office was decorated for the holidays, and Edward was invited to the staff party, not as a guest of honor, but
as a colleague, and he went expecting to feel out of place. And he did feel out of place at first, because the conversations were about projects he wasn't part of, about successes he hadn't contributed to. But he stayed anyway, and talked to people he'd never talked to before, the IT support staff, the operations team, the analysts who worked on the trading floor. And he learned that most of them had stories like Callum's. Stories of building skills slowly, of being underestimated, of working nights and weekends to create something real. And he realized that he'd spent his entire career in rooms with people like himself, people who performed success rather than building it. And those rooms had felt important, but they'd been echo chambers, and the real work had always been happening elsewhere. And he thought about his parents, his father, the head teacher, his mother, the pharmacist, who'd both done work that mattered, who'd served their communities with consistency and competence. And he realized he'd spent his life trying to transcend their example, trying to be more impressive than them, when actually, they'd been more substantial than he'd ever been. And he felt a deep regret, not for specific decisions, but for the orientation of his entire life, for prioritizing image over substance, for mistaking credentials for capability, for believing that success was about being recognized rather than being useful. And the regret was heavy, but it was also clarifying, because regret means you understand what matters, and understanding what matters is the first step toward living differently. And on the last working day before Christmas, Edward was packing up his things, and Callum stopped by his desk and said, "Mr. Fairfax, do you have a minute?" And Edward said, "Of course." And Callum said, "We're restructuring again in the new year." And Edward felt his stomach drop, because he assumed this meant he was being let go. And Callum said, "We're creating a new role, compliance and operational oversight.
We'd like you to consider it." And Edward said, "Why me?" And Callum said, "Because you've changed. You've stopped performing and started paying attention, and that's the skill we need." And Edward said, "I don't have a compliance background." And Callum said, "You have a legal background, and you understand our legacy systems, and you've been asking good questions, and good questions are more valuable than confident answers." And Edward said, "I'd need to learn a lot." And Callum said, "Yes, you would, but we think you can." And Edward felt something he hadn't felt in years, which was gratitude, not for being given something he deserved, but for being given a chance he hadn't earned yet. And he said, "Thank you." And Callum said, "Don't thank me yet. It's a real job with real expectations, and if you can't do it, we'll find someone who can." And Edward said, "Understood." And Callum nodded and walked away. And Edward sat at his desk and looked around the office and realized that this was the first time in his career he'd been offered a role based on what he might become rather than what he'd already been. And that felt more valuable than any title he'd held before. And the new year arrived, and Edward started his new role. And it was hard, because compliance work is detailed and technical and requires actual expertise, not performed expertise. And he made mistakes at first, sent reports with errors, missed deadlines, struggled with software he didn't understand. And Maya, who'd been promoted to operations coordinator, helped him patiently, showing him how systems worked, explaining processes without condescension. And Edward realized he was learning from someone 25 years younger than him, and that this was exactly what he needed. And he stopped worrying about status, stopped thinking about how he was perceived, and started focusing on doing the work correctly. And slowly he got better, and by spring he was producing reports that were actually useful, catching problems before they escalated, asking questions that helped the team
make better decisions. And one afternoon in March, Callum stopped by his desk and said, "Good work on the compliance audit, Edward." And Edward said, "Thank you," and noticed that Callum had called him Edward, not Mr. Fairfax. And that shift felt significant, like he'd finally been admitted to a group he once believed he was leading. And he thought about the gray Tuesday morning when his nameplate had been removed, when his belongings had been packed into a cardboard box, when he'd stood in the lobby, feeling his authority dissolve without sound. And he realized that morning hadn't been an ending. It had been a threshold between the life he'd performed and the life he might actually build. And the difference between those two lives was the difference between being recognized and being useful, between having a title and having a purpose. And Edward was 50 years old now, and he'd lost a decade to performance, but he had time to build something real, and that possibility felt more valuable than anything he'd lost. And one evening in late April, Edward was working late, finishing a report that was due the next morning, and Maya was also working late, preparing materials for a client meeting. And they were alone in the office. And Maya said,
"Mr. Fairfax, can I ask you something?" And Edward said, "Please call me Edward." And Maya said, "Okay, Edward, why did you stay?" And Edward said, "What do you mean?" And Maya said, "After everything that happened, after you were moved, most people would have left." And Edward thought for a moment and said, "I stayed because I finally understood I'd been performing my entire life, and I wanted to know what it felt like to be real." And Maya nodded and said, "That's brave." And Edward said, "It's not brave, it's just honest." And Maya said, "Sometimes those are the same thing." And they worked in silence for a while. And Edward thought about all the years he'd wasted, believing that confidence was enough, that image was substance, that authority could be borrowed from credentials and affiliations. And he
thought about Callum, who'd been 16 when they met, who'd asked about Bitcoin, who'd been dismissed, and who'd spent a decade building something real, while Edward had spent that same decade maintaining an illusion. And he thought about how much time he'd lost, but also about how much time he still had if he used it differently. And he finished his report and sent it to Callum, and packed his things and walked out into the April evening. And the city was alive with people leaving offices, heading to pubs, meeting friends, living their ordinary, extraordinary lives. And Edward felt connected to that life in a way he never had before, because he was no longer performing above it. He was participating in it, and that participation felt like dignity. And he took the tube home and made dinner, and sat by the window and looked out at the street, and thought about his parents, who'd done good work without recognition, who'd built lives of substance without applause. And he realized they'd been teaching him all along, but he'd been too busy performing to listen. And he thought about the lesson Callum had taught him, not through words but through example, which was that credibility isn't inherited or performed. It's built slowly, through consistency, through competence, through the patient accumulation of trust. And Edward was building that now, one report at a time, one question at a time, one day of honest work at a time. And it wasn't glamorous, and it wouldn't make him famous, and it wouldn't restore his old position, but it was real. And real was better than impressive, and true was better than recognized, and useful was better than admired. And he sat there as the evening deepened, and the lights came on across the city. And he thought about the fact that this was just one story in one city, and that all over the world there were people building things quietly, people learning from failure, people discovering that the performance of success is empty, and the substance of contribution is full. And he thought about how rarely those people were celebrated, and how much the world depended on them. And he decided that he wanted to be one of them, not someone who was celebrated, but someone who contributed. And that decision felt like the first honest choice he'd made in decades. And the city hummed outside, and Edward sat by the window and felt something he'd never felt before, which was the quiet satisfaction of knowing his work that day had mattered, not because anyone had recognized it, but because it had been done well, and that was enough. And if you made it to the end of this story, thank you for staying with it. And if it changed how you think about credibility and substance, then it did what it was meant to do. So subscribe to keep these stories coming, because every person has the capacity to choose substance over performance. And comment below with the name of someone who taught you the difference between seeming and being, because those teachers matter. And this is how we build better. The slow, patient, unglamorous work of becoming useful rather than impressive, one honest day at a time.